At least your sister had the sense to build something real. My mother set down her wine glass with the careful precision of a woman who wanted every person at that table to hear what came next. 22 relatives went quiet. 22 people who'd driven in from Sudbury, from Kingston, from as far as Moncton, sitting around the long table my brother-in-law had rented specifically because the dining room couldn't hold us all anymore. She let the silence do its work, the way she always did, and then she looked at me across the centerpiece my aunt had spent 3 days arranging. 38 years old, no husband, living out of a duffel bag for the government. A laugh moved through the table, not nervous, not accidental. The kind that starts when someone important fires first and everyone else joins in because it's safer to be on her side than to be caught standing next to me. My cousin's husband laughed the loudest. I noticed that. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate, not loudly, not as a statement, just down, because I didn't trust my hands to keep holding it without betraying something I wasn't ready to give her. I looked at my mother across the 12 feet of rented tablecloth and the 38 years of her having already decided what I was, and I said one word. Ironwood. At the far end of the table, near the drink station my uncle had set up by the back window, my father's oldest friend, a man named Stuart who'd worked 31 years with Transport Canada and had hands like he'd spent those years actually doing something with them, went completely still. He was 71 years old. He'd survived a cardiac event 2 Januaries ago and still looked like the kind of man who would have walked back into whatever almost killed him if someone needed him to. His glass of ginger ale tilted and then fell, hitting the edge of the table and rolling to the floor, and he didn't look down at it. He was looking at me. Stop! His voice came out scraped, lower than his speaking voice, like something he hadn't used in a long time. Everyone stop right now. He pushed himself to his feet. That's Ironwood. That's the Ironwood file. The laughter didn't stop gradually. It cut, the way sound cuts when someone pulls a cord from the wall. 22 people who thought they were participating in a joke understood in the space of one breath that they had been participating in something else entirely. But before I tell you what Ironwood means, and why a man who had seen the inside of a federal emergency operations center at 2 in the morning was gripping the back of his chair hard enough to whiten his knuckles at the sight of me, subscribe to this channel, because what Stuart said next, no one at that table was prepared to hear. Stuart didn't ask permission. He didn't look at my mother, didn't acknowledge the table, didn't perform the politeness of a guest in someone else's house. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded a piece of paper that had been folded so many times the creases had become soft as cloth. Then he reached in again and laid down a second sheet and a third. 11 pages in total, arranged on the tablecloth in front of him, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to put them there, and had been carrying them long enough that he was ready. I kept these, he said, voice still unsteady, because I was there and I needed to remember what real looked like. The table didn't know where to look. I did. I was looking at the far wall, at the window above the drinks table where the last of the October light was going gray, running the same scan I run in any room where I don't control the exits. 22 people. Who was going to look to my mother for instructions on how to feel? Who was going to reach for their phone? Who was already rearranging the night in their memory so that none of this had happened? My cousin was looking at the tablecloth. The loud-lawing brother-in-law had his arms crossed and his jaw set, which meant he'd already decided Stuart was making a scene. My sister had her hand on my mother's arm, which was never about comfort. It was always about positioning. My mother recovered the way she always did, before the silence had a chance to settle into anything that couldn't be walked back. She softened her voice into the register she used when she was explaining something difficult to someone she pitied. Stuart, I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do. But you know how she gets. She always had a way of attaching herself to situations that were bigger than her actual role. A ripple moved through the table. Relief, mostly. Someone had offered a handhold. My sister took it less than a second, leaning forward with a little furrow of concern that she'd spent years perfecting. Are you doing okay? You seem really wound up tonight. The question was constructed to do one thing: move me from a woman someone just stood up for to a woman who needed to be managed. Not decorated, not serious, wound up. I picked my fork back up, set it back down, 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. Something my supervisor at the agency had taught me in the first year, when I was 26 and running on adrenaline and not much else, and she'd sat me down and said, "You cannot make good decisions when your nervous system thinks it's being hunted." I stood, walked to the end of the table, shook Stuart's hand, one pump firm, eyes level. "Thank you for coming, Stuart. It means a lot." Just enough that anyone in that room who was paying attention understood that I already knew every detail of what was in those pages, and had known for a long time. Stuart leaned close, lowered his voice below the table noise. "Pierce. He's being honored next Saturday in Ottawa. The National Public Safety Foundation dinner at the Chateau Laurier. Lifetime achievement. The fund is named after the operation. One beat. I nodded. The road had just presented itself. I didn't go back inside after dinner. I sat in my car on the street outside my mother's house, with the engine off and the heat ticking down and both hands on the wheel because it was the position I defaulted to when I needed to think without distraction. The muscle memory of 10 years on call always was one notification away from moving. When I leaned over to pull my jacket from the back seat, my hand touched the edge of a photo my mother had left on the passenger seat. I didn't know how it got there. It was from the year I turned 14. My mother stood in the center, arm around my sister's shoulders. My sister had just been accepted to the French immersion program at the school across the city, the one with the waiting list, the one my mother had put her name on before she was out of kindergarten. I was at the far left of the frame, body angled slightly away, because there'd been nowhere else to stand once everyone else had already arranged themselves around the two of them. My 14-year-old face wasn't angry. It wasn't sad, exactly. It was the face of someone who had already understood, at a cellular level, that some rooms were just not configured for her. The memories didn't arrive in any order that made narrative sense. They came the way difficult things always do, in pieces that don't fit together until they do. The year I was recruited into the Federal Emergency Management stream, my mother didn't ask for the start date, didn't mark it on the calendar above the phone in the kitchen. When I mentioned it at Thanksgiving, she said that's interesting, and then turned to ask my sister if the new position at the firm was still going well. The year my sister made partner, my mother took the whole family to a restaurant in the distillery district. Reservations 3 weeks in advance. She wore the silk blouse she saved for things that mattered. The year I was part of the response team during the flooding in the lower Ottawa Valley, when we worked 72 hours without a rotation because there weren't enough of us and the water wasn't waiting, I called home when it was over. My mother said she'd seen something about it on the news, and had I eaten. The year I was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal at a ceremony that 40 people attended, I sent her the date 3 times. She had a prior commitment. I learned not to send the dates. I was 17 the first time I understood what my mother had decided about me. I was standing in the kitchen telling her I wanted to apply to the Public Service Leadership Development Program, the one that required a regional nomination, and she looked at me the way she looked at the weather when it wasn't cooperating, not angry, patient, explaining, "That's a very competitive program," she said. "They take people with very specific profiles." She didn't say not you. She didn't need to. Beside her, my sister was doing homework at the island and didn't look up. She rarely needed to. My mother was the one who said the difficult things. My sister just stayed in the room while they were said, which was its own kind of participation. I put the photograph in the glove compartment, not in the garbage. Evidence has a way of becoming necessary when you least expect it. I thought about something my first supervisor had written in my second-year review, a sentence I'd kept because it was the first time a professional document had described me accurately. Demonstrates an unusual capacity to remain oriented under conditions of sustained ambiguity. 16 years of that capacity, applied in flood-damaged community centers and forest fire evacuation corridors and a basement operations room during a rail derailment outside Lac-Mégantic, that nobody talked about publicly because talking about it publicly would have required explaining how close it came. And then the year that Ironwood fell apart and everything that came after it. Fall of 2018. Ice storm moving across eastern Ontario, second night, roads sealed. A community of 400 people in the townships northeast of Kingston cut off. Power down, cell towers down, one elderly care facility with backup generators that were showing fault codes the on-site staff couldn't interpret. The regional director, a man named Pierce who was 2 years from retirement and had spent those 2 years making sure everyone understood that, had already issued the call. Assets returned to base, conditions too dangerous for ground movement, hold position until the storm system clears. I was 40 minutes out, in a truck with 2 colleagues and a case of equipment that didn't weigh anything next to what was sitting in that care facility. One of my colleagues, a woman named Jo who'd been doing this job for 9 years and had a daughter she was already texting her location to, looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "Your call." Not because it was my call by rank. Because she'd worked with me long enough to know which way I was going to call it, and she was telling me she was in. We drove into the ice storm. The road took the first hit 20 minutes later, a branch the diameter of my thigh coming down across the hood, and I kept going because going back was no longer the faster option. We reached the care facility at 4 in the morning. The backup generators had 15 minutes left, maybe 20. Inside, an overnight nurse named Yvette, 63 years old, had been manually monitoring every patient on a list for 6 hours because the automated systems had gone down with the power. She hadn't stopped moving since before we arrived. When the generator finally stabilized and the lights came back to full, and Yvette sat down on the edge of a chair in the corridor and put her face in her hands, I sat down next to her and didn't say anything. because some moments don't need words inserted into them. We got everyone through the night. Coming home was not the same as being safe. Pierce had filed a report before I was back in cell range. It described the decision to enter the storm system as a unilateral breach of emergency protocol, endangering government assets and personnel, motivated by what he called an individual need to override collegial decision-making. Every word of it had been written to make me sound like a liability. 2 journalists received background information from sources inside the regional office, the kind of anonymous that wears a director's title. The story that ran used phrases like rogue coordinator and disregard for established safety procedure. Nobody printed the part about the generators. Nobody called Yvette. The narrative was already poured by the time anyone thought to ask the people who were there. I called home. The only time in my adult life I cried on the phone to my mother. Not as a coordinator or a colleague or a professional with 16 years of unblemished record. As a daughter sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in Kingston at 7 in the morning, asking the woman who'd been my first model of what strength was supposed to look like to say 3 words. I believe you. She listened. I told her everything. The ice storm, the generators, Yvette, the report, the journalists, the way Pierce had filed before I could debrief. I told her how close it had been, not the generators, the other close, the kind that happens when you're sitting alone with the full weight of a decision that didn't go wrong but nearly could have, and the only stories anyone is telling are the ones where it would have. She waited until the last of it was out. And then she said, voice level almost tired, I told you that work was too much pressure for you. You were always better when the stakes were smaller. She hung up without a goodbye. I held the phone for 9 seconds. I know because the bedside clock was directly across from where I was sitting, and I watched the numbers change before I put the phone down and understood that she hadn't been waiting for this moment to believe me. She'd been waiting for it to confirm what she'd always thought. 3 days later, my partner of 4 years sent a message asking me to call when I had a moment. I called. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask what had happened in the storm, whether the report was going to affect my file, whether any of it had been as bad as it looked. He said he'd been offered a position in Vancouver, and that the timing felt like something, and that he'd been meaning to talk to me about where things were heading between us, and he thought this was probably a natural point, to be honest with each other. He said he thought we'd been more parallel than together for a long time. He wasn't wrong about that. He just said it the way people say true things when the true thing also happens to be convenient for them. He didn't say he was sorry. The thing that held was my deputy minister, a woman named Patricia, who'd spent 30 years in the public service and had seen enough internal politics to know one when she walked past it. She requested my file before Pierce could close the internal review, flagged the timeline irregularities in his report, and had me quietly transferred to a national coordination desk where my name disappeared from the regional chain of command and Pierce couldn't reach it. She also said something I wrote down because I knew I'd need it later. You don't win this today. You survive it long enough that the record corrects itself. That's the job right now. Survive and be excellent at something no one can question. I said, yes, Deputy Minister. She said, good, and then she said one more thing before she closed the door. When it corrects, I'll be there. 3 years had passed since Ironwood by the time I was sitting in the car outside my mother's house with Stuart's pages in my bag and a route to Ottawa assembling itself without my full permission. 3 years, and my mother had not asked once, not in a text, not at Christmas, not at my niece's birthday where we'd stood 6 feet apart for 4 hours being polite at each other, whether the record had corrected, whether I was still in the job I'd trained 16 years to do, whether the nights had gotten easier. Patricia had kept her word. Stuart had kept newspaper clippings in his breast pocket like they were documents of historical significance, which, to him, they were. Joe sent me a voice message every December 21st, the anniversary of the storm, saying nothing except I'd make the same call again, and then hanging up. Next Saturday, in Ottawa, a man who had filed a false report and fed lies to journalists was going to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award funded by an organization named after an operation he had abandoned from the safety of a climate-controlled office. The dinner crowd dispersed the way people disperse when something has happened that they don't have the vocabulary for, quickly, with excessive focus on retrieving jackets and locating keys, performing the gestures of normal departure to avoid having to account for what they'd witnessed. My cousin left without making eye contact. The brother-in-law spent a long time in the front hallway saying something to my sister that I wasn't close enough to hear. My mother went inside without another word, which was not the absence of a response. It was a different kind of response. Stuart walked out to the street with me. He didn't ask permission, just fell in beside me the way people who've spent their professional lives moving toward problems do, automatically, without deliberating about it. He stopped at a respectful distance when I reached my car. Far enough that I could leave without explanation if I needed to. You don't have to say anything, he said. He reached into his jacket and held out the 11 pages he'd laid on the table. These belong with you. I looked at the top sheet. A document from an independent review of the regional emergency response failures in 2018, published quietly in 2020, distributed internally without press release. It named the Ironwood response as a case study in effective frontline decision-making under conditions where protocol had failed to account for actual ground circumstances. My name was in it, not redacted. There. I found this 2 years after, he said. I kept thinking, does anyone who should know about this actually know? And the answer, mostly, was no. But I thought at least one person should be holding proof. Something settled in my chest. Not relief exactly, not happiness. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who had no obligation to look. While Pierce was writing a report designed to make my judgment sound reckless. While my partner was calculating his exit. While my mother was waiting for confirmation that she'd been right about me all along. A retired Transport Canada senior coordinator had been cutting out pages and keeping them in his jacket because he thought the truth deserved at least one custodian. I drove home with the pages on the passenger seat and Patricia's number already on my screen. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. It was 10:30. I was wondering when you'd call, she said. Pierce is in Ottawa next Saturday. Pause. She was quiet for the beat of someone arranging thoughts she'd already had. The Ironwood Review, I said. The findings were never entered into the regional record. They were published externally but never formally incorporated. Correct, Patricia? I booked my ticket last week, she said. Front row. I set the phone down, looked at the pages on the seat. 7 days. I had been waiting 3 years. 7 more days was not a number that required any adjustment. I was pulling on my coat when my mother appeared from the side gate. She moved faster than I expected, carrying a glass container of leftover soup, the good soup, the one she made from a recipe her own mother had written in a notebook that was older than I was. She made it once a year, and she made it for occasions that meant something to her. In 38 years, she had never once made it for an occasion that involved me. You didn't eat much, she said. Her voice was different. The razor edge she deployed without effort at the dinner table was gone, replaced by something softer that I'd heard her use with my sister for as long as I could remember and never quite learned to trust when it was directed at me. Let me give you this to take home. I looked at the container. I'm fine. Thank you. She didn't move back toward the gate. Stuart doesn't have full context, she said, patient now, the voice she used when she was certain of something. He's a lovely man, but he worked in a different department and he's going on second-hand information. Those kinds of reports, they don't tell the whole story. Her eyes moved to the back gate every few seconds. She was managing, not speaking. There was a difference, and I had had years to learn it. You've always taken things so hard, she said. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying it because it worries me. My sister materialized at her shoulder the way she always did, casually, as if she'd simply wandered over, which meant she'd been listening from the gate. Hey, are you okay? You went really quiet at dinner. The question was engineered with real precision. In 3 words, it had moved me from someone Stuart had just publicly validated to someone the family was concerned about. It repositioned the evening, reorganized the story. I looked at my sister, let the silence go 1 beat longer than comfortable. Then I looked at my mother. I'm not going to do this tonight, I said, voice even, not raised, not performing calm, but actually there. Not because I don't have things to say, because what I need to say isn't meant for this parking spot on a Friday night. My mother opened her mouth. I kept going. Stuart's report is accurate. The independent review confirms it. And on Saturday in Ottawa, that's going to be a matter of public record. I opened the car door. You don't have to believe me tonight. You never have. I've stopped needing you to. I drove home through streets that were turning wet with the beginning of the kind of November rain that doesn't commit to being anything, just sits on everything and makes the world look like it hasn't decided yet. Both hands on the wheel. Box breathing. The habit I'd carried out of emergency management and into the rest of my life. The tool that worked equally well at 2 in the morning waiting for a storm to clear, and at 10 at night outside my mother's house, which were, I had come to understand, not entirely different situations. Ottawa in November had a particular quality that I'd always found clarifying. Something about the grayness and the purposefulness of the people moving through it, everyone there because the country required something of them that week. The Chateau Laurier sat at the corner of Wellington like it had been placed there to remind you that things had been decided in this country for a long time and would continue to be, and that you were briefly part of that continuum. I wore my service pin and my department ID, not the lanyard of an attendee, which meant when the man at the door told me my name wasn't on the guest list, he had to look twice at what he was actually looking at. I'm not on the list, I said. I'm here as part of the record. He found somewhere else to be. From across the room, I could see Pierce at the center of a cluster of people in expensive suits, the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether the room was configured for him. He saw me at the same moment I identified him. The smile didn't disappear immediately, it underwent a process. It processed my service pin, my posture, the fact that I hadn't come with anyone and hadn't looked for anyone since walking in. Then it processed my face, which he had spent 3 years working to erase from the institutional record, and which was standing in front of him in the Chateau Laurier ballroom on the night he was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award named after the operation he'd abandoned. I walked to a table near the center of the room, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the surface. I had learned this from Patricia, who had learned it from someone before her. If you walk in like you belong somewhere, most people will not stop to verify whether you actually do. Phone buzzed. Patricia, in position. Everything is in order. I turned the phone face down. Pierce approached before the program started, which told me everything I needed to know about how he was processing my presence. He needed to assess it and, if possible, neutralize it before the room's attention organized around the stage. Sloane. He extended his hand, projecting warmth with the precision of someone who'd been doing it for long enough that it came out smooth. You look well, glad you could join us. I let the silence stretch for 4 full seconds. Let him feel the weight of those 4 seconds, which were not empty. Well enough to remember every detail of October 2018 in full, Raymond. I looked at his hand. And it's Dr. Whitmore, please. I finished my doctorate in 2021. He lowered his hand. His smile didn't return. He walked back toward the podium with his shoulders set higher than they'd been when he walked over, which meant the smile was gone because something real had taken its place. He just let me see it. That was the first mistake. Patricia materialized in the chair to my right without any announcement. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We'd worked together long enough that our silences were functional rather than awkward. The program began. The MC introduced Pierce's career in the language of someone who'd been handed excellent material, decisive leadership under pressure, unwavering commitment to public safety, a career defined by the kind of integrity the public service needs most. Every word of it was a small and deliberate violence against every person who'd been in the field that October without his support. I set both hands flat on the table and breathed. Pierce took the podium. He opened with the practiced gravity of a man who'd given versions of this speech for long enough that he'd stopped distinguishing between the performance of conviction and conviction itself. Sacrifice, service, the weight of responsibility, the duty to make difficult calls when the situation demands it. The room responded on cue, the polite ripple of applause at the right intervals, the nodding at the engineered pauses, 200 people doing what rooms do when the person at the front has enough institutional authority that disagreement feels impolite. I didn't applaud. Sat with my spine against the chair back, eyes steady on him, not performing attention, but actually paying it. He felt it. You can always feel a room that's not entirely with you. It changes the air. Fear, I've learned, makes people make decisions they wouldn't make if they'd had another 60 seconds to think. Pierce made his. Among those who've served in emergency management, he said, voice shifting into a register calibrated to read as reluctant honesty, there are individuals whose judgment, while well-intentioned, ultimately couldn't be trusted in situations requiring team-oriented decision-making. It isn't comfortable to say, but accountability demands we acknowledge that sometimes protocol exists precisely to protect against the consequences of individual overreach. He looked directly at my table. He'd constructed the sentence to land there. He had just walked into the only position in the room where he had no cover. A chair moved. The sound of it was clean and specific in the carpeted silence of the ballroom. Stuart Briggs stood up from the third row, one hand on the chair back, 71 years old, and moving like he hadn't decided yet whether his knees were going to cooperate, and not particularly caring either way. I was in that operations center. 4 words, no microphone. He didn't need one. The room had the quality of something that has been waiting for a sound and has now heard it. Every head turned. Pierce's expression went through several things quickly. He tried for dismissive first, which was a mistake, because Stuart's posture made dismissive look small. Stuart, I appreciate your passion, but this really isn't the venue. You signed the withdrawal order. Stuart didn't raise his voice. He was 68 decibels and every one of them landed clean against the back wall. I saw it. The timestamp was 2:47 in the morning. The coordinator on the ground called in confirmation of critical life risk at 2:52, 5 minutes. She was already in the storm before your order cleared the facts. He pointed at me, straight at me, no hesitation, arm solid. This woman drove into conditions you declared unpassable and kept 400 people alive through the night. And you filed the report the next morning before she was debriefed. The murmur that moved through the room was not quiet. It was the sound of 200 people revising what they thought this evening was. Pierce's forehead caught the light wrong, which meant it was damp. His hands on the podium were tight enough to be visible from where I was sitting. He was sinking and he knew it, and the worst hadn't arrived. The paramedic who'd been part of the mutual aid response that night stood up from the middle section. She was in civilian clothes, no lanyard, someone who'd come because Stuart had called her. I worked triage that night from an Ironwood staging point. No extraction support came from regional command. One government vehicle arrived, and she was driving it. A retired public servant 3 rows behind her rose without preamble. I was on the independent review panel in 2020. The findings were clear. The protocol failure was systemic and directorial. The frontline response was not the problem. Then from the second row, a woman I hadn't seen since the storm itself stood up slowly, in the careful way of someone who doesn't move quickly anymore. Yvette, 66 now, in a blouse she'd clearly worn because this was an occasion. She didn't make a speech. She held up one piece of paper, an Ontario Volunteer Services Award citation, issued in 2019 to the Emergency Management Coordinator, whose intervention had prevented a mass casualty event at a long-term care facility during an ice storm in the Kingston Townships. She'd framed it. I could see it from where I sat. She'd taken it out of the frame to bring it tonight. She sat with me, Yvette said, voice that had been steadying people through hard nights for 4 decades. After it was over, she didn't have to. She stayed and she sat with me. The room had gone into a particular kind of silence that I recognized because I'd been in rooms where it happened, not often. The silence of collective recalibration. Of 200 people discovering that the story they'd just been told didn't contain the same facts as the one unfolding in front of them. Pierce had both hands white on the podium. He was looking for a place to put his eyes that didn't confirm what the room was showing him, and not finding one. Patricia rose from the chair beside me. Unhurried, no theatrics, the movement of someone who had waited 3 years for the right moment and was very clear that this was it. The room went quieter still when they registered her. The independent review findings from 2020 have been formally submitted to the Regional Emergency Management Record, effective this week, she said, voice carrying the specific authority of someone who has spent 30 years knowing exactly which words are the load-bearing ones. The original incident report has been amended. The institutional record now reflects what the ground record has always shown. She paused. If the Foundation would like to review the implications for this evening's citation, I'm available after the program. No way back. Not tonight. Not with 200 people in the room and Yvette's framed citation still in the air. The paramedic sat down. The retired public servant sat down. Yvette folded her paper carefully and sat down. And then Stuart raised his hand to the level of his brow, slowly and without ceremony, and held it there. The man behind him did the same, then the woman beside him. Row by row, without prompting, without coordination, the room moved into stillness, and the stillness was an answer. I stood, heels together, raised my hand to return it, held it as long as the room needed. From near the main entrance, I registered movement without turning to look directly. My mother, who had driven to Ottawa because she needed to see this for herself, because 3 years of not asking had run out, and she needed to know which version of her daughter was real, was sliding down the wall beside the door, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other braced against the wainscoting. Seeing everything. Watching Stuart hold his salute. Watching Yvette with her framed citation. Watching 200 people stand in silence for the truth that had taken 3 years to reach a room large enough to hold it. My sister stood behind her, phone in her hand, completely still, every rehearsed expression she had practiced for public occasions emptied from her face. The sentence had been spoken. No judge required. 4 days after Ottawa, 11 in the morning, 2 knocks on my apartment door. Quiet. The kind of knock that isn't sure it has standing. I checked through the peephole. My mother stood in the corridor without her coat buttoned properly, which was not how she appeared in the world. Her hair was pinned back instead of styled. In her hands, a glass jar of the soup. The good soup, the one from the notebook recipe, the one that meant something. Still warm, I could see the condensation on the glass. I rested my hand on the inside of the door, breathed, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. Then I opened it, didn't step back, didn't make space. Just stood in the doorway. Sloane. Her voice broke on the first syllable, which I had never heard in 38 years. Not once. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I looked at her. Not angry. Not soft. Leveled the way you get when something is finally arrived that you stopped expecting. You didn't understand, or you chose not to look for the information that would have let you understand. She started to speak. I kept going. You had my number. Every deployment, every file, every year I was doing work you could have asked me to explain. You had a way to reach me. You chose to let the silence accumulate. Give me a chance. She reached for my arm. I moved back 1 step. Not performance. Practical. You don't want a chance to understand me, I said. You want a chance to feel better about what you've been. Those are different things. You need the second one. That's not something I can give you, she cried. Not the strategic crying I'd seen her deploy at family events to shift the emotional climate of a room. The other kind. The kind that happens when the weight lands all at once and there's nowhere to put it except your face. A notification appeared on my phone later that afternoon. A text from my sister, 3 minutes after a missed call. Mom is really upset. I know things are complicated, but could you maybe soften how you respond to her? It would help everyone. Not a single question about what the 3 years had cost me. Not a syllable of acknowledgement about what had happened in Ottawa, or the storm, or the file, or the decade of Sunday dinners where she'd sat at that table and watched and never once said a word in a different direction. Just, could Morgan be less inconvenient? That was the last answer I was going to need. No contact was no longer a question I was holding. It was the finding. I went to the door, my hand steady on the frame. Please go home, Mum. Don't come back without calling first, and I may not answer. Not said in heat. In the voice of someone who has been deciding this for 3 years across 1,000 ordinary moments and has simply finished deciding. I closed the door. The lock turned. The sound it made was precise and final and smaller than I expected, for a sound that closed so much. Pierce called 2 weeks later, asked to meet. I drove to a Tim Hortons on a secondary highway outside Canada. His choice, which told me something, because it was nowhere near anything he was usually associated with. He was already there when I arrived, both hands around a coffee cup, no jacket with his title on it, no aide, nothing that conferred anything. Just a 67-year-old man in a vinyl booth who had been carrying something for 3 years and had arrived at the point where the carrying was heavier than the putting down. He admitted everything, methodically, in the order it had happened. The withdrawal order, the report he'd filed before I was debriefed, the background calls to journalists, the decision to bury the independent review findings. When he finished, he asked, "Why didn't you push harder to correct it sooner? You had the review findings from 2020. I looked at him across the table. No anger, no satisfaction, just the clarity of something that had had a long time to settle. Because fighting you on your terms would have cost me the career I'd spent 16 years building. I chose to be better than the story you tried to make me into. Every file I closed, every community I worked in, every colleague I brought through a hard situation, all of it happened because I refused to let you be the defining thing about my professional life." I paused. "You wanted me to be the cautionary tale. I became the standard instead. You'll carry that distinction for whatever's left." I put money on the table, stood, and walked out into gray November air that tasted like the beginning of something cleaner. Stuart called the following Thursday. Not about Pierce, not about Ottawa, just his regular voice on the line, unhurried. "I help run a small group, every second Tuesday, community center in Barhaven. Coffee and whoever shows up. Former first responders, some public servants who've been through rough files. No agenda, just people who've learned that isolation isn't the same as being fine." I drove out on the Tuesday. Wore my regular coat, no work ID, no context attached. The room was smaller than I expected, which somehow made it easier. 11 chairs in a rough circle. Coffee from a machine that charged $1.50. A box of Tim Hortons Timbits on a table by the window, the way every Canadian gathering eventually produces Timbits regardless of the occasion or the formality level, as if they generate spontaneously wherever people need to get through something together. I took a chair near the wall out of habit, back where I could see the door, a positioning I'd been doing since year 2 on the job, and was probably doing until I died. I hadn't planned to say anything. I'd come because Stuart had asked, and that had been enough. But when the group moved around the circle and the facilitator looked at me and offered the floor, I looked across the room and my gaze settled on a man in the far corner, late 30s. Wearing the particular expression of someone who has been very competent at a very hard job for a very long time, and has recently discovered that competence doesn't protect you from the specific kind of erosion that accumulates when no one ever acknowledges what the job actually costs. I recognized that expression not because I'd seen it on someone else, but because I'd seen it in my mirror for most of 3 years. I stood up. No notes, no professional framing, just the truth which I'd learned sounds different from any other register. "The hardest part," I said, voice lower than my presenting voice, the voice I used in rooms where I was trying to be heard rather than projected, "isn't the crisis itself. It's what comes after, when you're back at the kitchen table and the adrenaline is gone and the institutional memory of what you did is already being written by someone who wasn't there. The hardest part is when you start to wonder if the silence around you means they were right about you all along." The man in the corner looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has been hoping to hear a specific thing said out loud. "I've heard of you," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "What does Ironwood mean?" I heard someone say it at the door. I looked at him. And for the first time since Ottawa, maybe for the first time in 3 years, the thing in my chest that had been tensed around the memory of that night in the ice storm, and what came after it, the thing that had been doing the work of holding all of it in place, finally loosened. I smiled. Not the managed expression of someone performing recovery. The real version, small and actual. "Ironwood is a tree," I said. one of the hardest woods in North America. It doesn't grow fast, it grows dense. It takes decades to become what it is, and when a storm comes through, it doesn't break. It bends a little. It stays standing. I looked around the circle. 11 people who'd spent years moving toward problems, while other people moved away from them, each of them carrying something they hadn't been given the language to put down. But for the people I worked with, it came to mean something specific. It meant that when the conditions told you to turn back, you stayed, not because you were reckless. Because you understood that there was someone in there who couldn't get out on their own, and you were the person who could go in. The man's face changed, not dramatically. The way faces change when something that's been held a long time is briefly given permission to be set down. Around the circle, people nodded. The slow nod of recognition of something finally named. I drove home through a city that was dark by 4:30, the way Canadian cities go dark in November, the streetlights doing their limited best against a sky that had made its decision for the season. Window cracked slightly because I still needed to feel the cold air on my face when I was processing things. I thought about my mother in the Waco house, sitting with the soup jar she'd driven back to Barrie with, in a house where the family portrait still hung in the front hall, my 35-year-old face at the edge of the frame, body angled slightly out because there hadn't been room any other way. I wondered if she'd taken it down. I decided it was no longer the question that mattered. I thought about Pierce, who was going to wake up tomorrow and every day after it knowing that 200 people in the Chateau Laurier had watched the architecture of his professional legacy become load-bearing on nothing. I thought about my sister, somewhere drafting the text that would make this easier for her to hold, finding the angle that left her outside it. All of them living inside something they had built and now couldn't leave without acknowledging it needed to be torn down first. But not me. I had gone into the storm, every version of it. The ice and the dark roads and the generators with 15 minutes left. The report filed before I could give my account. The phone call where I'd cried and been told I'd been right to doubt myself. The 38 years of standing at the edge of every photograph this family took, placed in the space left after everyone else had already arranged themselves around the people who mattered. And I had walked myself back out, not because someone had arrived with clearance documents and an apology, because I had decided every single Tuesday morning for 3 years that I was worth the maintenance, worth the work of staying coherent and functional and good at something real, even when the only person keeping the official record of that was me. The quiet in the car was not the quiet of being alone. It was the quiet that comes after you've stopped arguing with the verdict and realized the verdict was wrong and the court doesn't get a second hearing. The quiet of someone who has been standing at the margin of the frame for so long that she's finally stopped waiting to be moved to the center and has simply walked out of the photograph altogether. Ironwood, still standing.